In 2021, Senator Kim Pate and MP Leah Gazan put forward bills in the Senate and the House of Commons for the federal government to start working on a framework for a guaranteed basic income in Canada. In this interview, we're talking to Senator Kim Pate about what we can do in the year leading up to the next federal election and why basic income is so urgently needed right now. Okay, we are here with Senator Kim Pate. Thanks so much for having us today.
Thank you. It's wonderful to have you here.
Okay, so in December 2021, almost 3 years ago, you introduced Bill S-233, a bill to establish a national framework for a Canadian basic income. Around this time, pandemic supports were drying up, and the Ontario Basic Income Pilot had already been prematurely canceled by the current provincial government. We're going to talk to you about your bill today and what we can all do to help. But just to get started, what does a basic income mean to you, and why do you think it's so important right now?
So I've thought a basic income is important for an awful long time. In fact, it's been part of much of the work I've been doing for the past more than 2 decades. And it's what brought me to the Senate. I have spent decades, the better part of 5 decades, working with people who have been criminalized and imprisoned. And what I know from that experience is most of those people did not have economic security. The intersections of poverty, of racism, of gender discrimination, of disability really increase the likelihood that people who are failed by every other system will end up in the prison system as they try to negotiate poverty, as they try to negotiate living on the streets, for instance, as they try to negotiate past trauma of abuse. And so we know that, of course, from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry as well. The very same issues that they talked about gave rise to Indigenous women being more likely to be disappeared, murdered, on the street are the exact same issues that cause them to be more likely to be in prison. And poverty is one of them. And that's why they recommended as well that a guaranteed livable income be part of the array of supports available. So my whole purpose in coming to the Senate was to actually work on building a robust social, economic, and health support system so that nobody in this country is left behind. And the timing of the bill was in part, as you've indicated, we were watching the government roll out benefits to people in a laudable way. All of us were thinking, this is fabulous. This shows us that we could actually do this. But unfortunately, still 3.5 to 5 million people in this country were left behind.
You spent a lot of your life working with youth on one hand, but also people from various marginalized groups who are overrepresented in the prison system, as you mentioned. How did that shape your thinking about basic income?
It was the main part of what shaped my feeling. When I was, I grew up a working class kid. When I recognize I had huge opportunities that not everybody does, that comes from the type of background I come from. And when I went to law school, I was taught that the law applies equally to everybody. And then it became very clear that's not true. That if you have resources, if you have power, if you have privilege, then you have benefits that, do 2 things. That one, you're less likely to come to the attention of police and authorities, whether it's child welfare, whether it's police, whether it's economic authorities, people, policing social assistance schemes, for instance. Mm-hmm. And, there was a quote that I often use. I'm not going to get it fully correct, but the person was Anatole France from 1700s in France. And they said something to the effect of, the law applies equally to the rich and the poor. Neither is permitted to sleep under bridges or steal bread. Well, to me, that epitomizes exactly what the aha moments I had as I was studying law, and then, more importantly, as I was going out through a clinical law program that I was involved with in my final year of law school. And I realized, okay, the law applies equally, but who's more likely to end up in a position where they're going to be on the streets, or they're going to be struggling with poverty, or they're going to have fewer opportunities for education?
And you've talked about how kids from poor families, but also marginalized groups, Black and Indigenous people, are fast-tracked into the prison system, and also how it's preventable. Can you explain kind of how that fast-tracking related to poverty happens, and how a basic income could help prevent that?
So when I first started working with young people, I was in Halifax. I went to school, did law school at Dalhousie, and the clinical law program. I represented a lot of the kids. I had done an independent research project on what was then the new youth law coming in, called the Young Offenders Act, and so I was suddenly representing all these young people, and what I saw very clearly was the difference between who was charged, who was prosecuted, who was convicted, and who was sentenced to prison. And disproportionately, it was the poor kids, the racialized kids, who, and in particular in Halifax, the black kids, who suddenly were the massively overrepresented amongst the groups that were both criminalized and imprisoned. And then when I moved west and was working in Alberta, it was, predominantly Indigenous kids and First Nations kids and Métis kids, and so it became very clear that the level of privilege was more an indication of how likely you are to be criminalized and imprisoned than it was the harm you were causing in the community. And so, if how much money and power and privilege you had determined whether you were held criminally responsible, then it really cast doubt on a lot of the work we still do, which is the criminal law really about protecting society, or is it about social control? And so, one of the things that my hope is not just to prevent people from being criminalized and imprisoned, that a guaranteed livable income might assist, but also for people who are coming out of prison. Many come out with nowhere to go, no supports, and this would provide an opportunity for people to also get on their feet. And so, and similarly, for those who are victimized, I can't tell you how many times I worked with particularly women and children who were escaping violence, who didn't have the means to leave sometimes, were stuck in situations because they didn't have the resources. So for those who are victimized as well, it's a way to assist. And many times, people who have lost family members because they've been murdered, or because they're disappeared, if they don't have incomes, can't actually take time off work to grieve, to deal with the necessary healing that needs to happen. How horrible is that in your own family, as you're grieving such a horrendous loss, you can't even take the time because you don't have benefits, you don't have the supports to do that. This would be, again, an opportunity for people to have, not have the same kind of, strictures around being able to do the things that are necessary in times of crisis, really, that to take care of themselves. And so, for those who are victimized, it's a guaranteed livable income provides an opportunity for people to actually not only deal with the issues they have to deal with, but take the time to be able to heal and move on in the future.
And to go back to people being incarcerated, last time we chatted, you mentioned that we don't have the greatest data on the connection between incarceration and poverty, but the data that we do have shows that more than 80% of women are jailed for poverty-related issues. And then we know the rates of poverty among Indigenous and Black women is obviously very high. And one of your info sheets that you put out says 4 in 5 women in Canadian prisons are incarcerated for economic crimes that they saw as necessary for their family's financial survival.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the reality is the last time Stats Canada, and part of the issue around data is some provinces and territories contribute data to Stats Canada, some don't. Some look for this kind of information, some don't, quite frankly. But the last time we had this data, it was when I was working with the National Office of Elizabeth Fry. We looked at this information, and the stat that we were provided was, 82% of women who end up in the criminal legal system serving sentences for provincial or federal sentences are there for poverty-related offenses. Now, obviously, being poor in and of itself is not a crime. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like it could be stealing, shoplifting, as it's often referred to. It could be fraud in terms of, checks that bounce when, if people don't have the resources. It could look like other kinds of offenses that could be overpayment of social assistance, welfare fraud, as is often referred to, and it could be other forms of, going up to and including, although rarer, things like robbery or other kinds of theft. And so when you realize that the majority of people, particularly in the cases of the prisons designated for women, are there essentially for trying to survive poverty, and for those who are there for violent offenses, almost all of them are reacting to violence first perpetrated against them, and often are also poor. They're stuck in situations because of their economic inequality. And so when you recognize that, you realize a guaranteed level income could go a long way to preventing many people from being criminalized in the first place, and then not to mention the victimization of whoever's things are stolen or taken, or who are deprived of their economic supports as well.
That's a great point. And one thing that always comes up with basic income is cost. But a lot of people probably don't know that the average for keeping a woman in Canada in prison is anywhere from $150,000 to $200,000 a year. And it can be up to almost $500,000 for solitary. And so just based on around $150,000, $200,000 a year, that's to keep one woman in prison, which would almost pay for a basic income for like 10 women.
Absolutely. And when you realize that most everybody who works with women in prison, whether it's the correctional investigator who does work, even corrections themselves will say that many of the folks who are inside, men and women, but in particular women, that they could be in the community and not pose a risk to public safety. When you realize you're spending that kind of money, the human cost, the social cost, and the cost doesn't include the fact that the majority of women are mothers, many of them sole supports to their kids before they go to prison. Most of those kids end up in the care of the state. So we don't even factor in the cost of, the human cost of putting more kids in the system, in the child welfare system, what that means in terms of their likelihood of having disadvantage and likelihood of having other challenges in the future, including poverty, including possible criminalization. And so we end up with this horrible cycle that has huge human cost, social cost, and also comes with a massive price tag. And so it's estimated that, there are many, many women I know who have been in long past their parole eligibility dates. And for Indigenous women, for Black women, they're more likely to be classified as higher security, which means that we're talking about more than just the 150, I shouldn't say just, more than the 150 to 200,000, but the majority of them are actually in that 500,000 and plus category. And then if they start transferring them across the country, because of what's happening right now in the prairies is they're overcrowded, so they're shipping women all over the country. So then you add in those costs, you add in the cost of child welfare involvement. Why wouldn't we invest instead? The other thing that many Canadians don't know is that we spend more than $80 billion per year keeping people in poverty in this country. And what does that mean? That's food banks, it's social assistance schemes that are wholly inadequate. It's all of the mechanisms we currently spend that keep people ensnared in poverty instead of providing a rebound out of poverty for folks, which is what we would hope a guaranteed livable income would do.
And as part of your advocacy around your bill and basic income in general, you've talked about bringing politicians, senators, and MPs to prison with you, which you've been doing. Why do you feel like it's important for politicians to experience like that visit to prison? And then how do you use that when you're talking to them in terms of like talking about basic income?
So, I mean, the main reason for asking and encouraging senators to go to the jails, and MPs actually, is one, it wasn't so much about guaranteed livable income, but it's you're right, that people have seen who's actually in prison by going to the prisons. My main objective initially was to say, it was not an original thought. Louise Arbour said it years ago, that anybody who is responsible for criminal law, sentencing, policy, practice, so police officers, defense, crown prosecutors, lawyers, judges, legislators like MPs and senators who are passing laws and they don't know what the results or the consequences of those laws are, really don't have any business passing them. I'm paraphrasing what she said. And so most senators and MPs did not know that they have a right of access to our federal penitentiaries. So I wanted them to know, principally because there's this so-called law and order agenda that keeps, has these ebbs and flows, and if we end up with what the polls are predicting, another conservative government, we're likely to see another spark in those so-called law and order agenda. And what we know is that longer, more punitive sentences do not make us safer, but they do result in more people who are the most marginalized, particularly racialized, especially Indigenous, and even more especially Indigenous women ending up in prison. So you want politicians, legislators to know that. It's very clear often the context of so few opportunities. I remember one man saying, I would have loved, I forget what the question was from one of the senators about why didn't you go to school or why didn't you go to university? And his response was so clear. He said, I would have loved to have the opportunity to go to university. I was going from group home to group home. Even getting out of high school was a challenge. And then we heard from many who would say, I wanted to go to university and I told my counselor, and they basically laughed and said, don't waste your time. Someone like you will never get to university. And then we had senators who, Black and Indigenous senators, start talking about how that's the kind of messages they were given as well. And so to have that realization that, yeah, you may have got that message, but you also then may have had other supports in your life, in your community, in your family, in your environment that countered those messages and said, don't listen to that, go ahead anyway. And so I think those are all reasons why it's really important. And every visit to a prison, I think, this is a new reason why we should be doing this that I hadn't thought of. And so, everything from understanding, the links to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, to poverty, to, housing issues, to all of the issues that really need to be in place, or the supports that need to be in place for people.
And you just mentioned the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Call to Justice 4.5, which recommends a basic income for everyone in Canada, actually. It seems pretty obvious from everything we've been talking about why it's so important. But can you explain just to people watching why this is such an important call to justice?
As the commissioners saw when they were doing their work, the same issues that give rise to Indigenous women being disappeared and murdered are the same issues that give rise to them being imprisoned. And so, and one of the underlying throughout was the economic inequality that were experienced by Indigenous women. We know overall that Indigenous people are more likely to be living in less secure, less healthy, and poorer in terms of economic security environments, whether it's on reserve or in urban communities. And so that really was fundamental to their recommendation on that front.
I don't know if it's really that relevant, but do you feel like over half of Indigenous people are like urban Indigenous now? Does that affect like basic income? Is it like more important or less important, or is it kind of redundant? Or
no, I think it is important. I mean, the reality is that some folks think we shouldn't be, that we should be prioritizing on reserve. But as Leah and so many other Indigenous leaders have underscored, that we need to be looking, yes, at what's happening on reserve, but we also have to look at the folks who are in urban settings where they come under municipal and provincial social assistance or lack thereof supports.
Mm-hmm. And we already kind of talked about how a basic income could give women in abusive relationships a way to get out. But just to kind of just go back to it really quickly, the Winnipeg Free Press recently called intimate partner violence an epidemic. And you shared it on social media, and you added that victims of intimate partner violence are predominantly female, and that while Indigenous women make up only 5% of the women in Canada, they make up 20% of those who are killed by intimate partner violence.
One of the reasons that we don't deal with it, I think, is it's taken a long time for the system, the criminal legal system, but also society, to take seriously violence against women. I mean, just think of how many of us were raised thinking and being taught that it was our responsibility to protect ourselves from being victimized. How many of us were raised with, be careful where you go, who you're with, what you're wearing. Those are all messages that tell us all implicitly, both those who identify as women and men, that it's the woman's responsibility to protect herself. And really, it must be her fault if something happens. And that kind of thinking is taking, it's changed for lots of folks, but it's still it's still fundamentally at the crux of why disproportionately we see women, in particular racialized women, poor women, not dealt with fairly and not given opportunities to lead, to be believed, to leave, to then be able to thrive on their own. And I think, it's a combination of equality issues and a recognition that it privileges certain groups of individuals, predominantly men, who benefit from women being seen as unworthy of those kinds of protections, unworthy of the economic, the personal, and the health supports that would prevent them from being left in those situations.
Shane Pelletier, I don't know if they still are, but co-coordinator of the National Indigenous Homelessness Council, and who's also a member with lived experience on the National Advisory Council on Poverty, said a quote that really has stuck with me on a Maitri webinar one day. He said, "Poverty is extremely painful. It's complex. It's individual. It's different for everyone. It's shameful. It's suffocating. And it's heavy. Being poor is like serving a life sentence for a crime you didn't commit." What's that bring up for you?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, I think of the work that Dr. Zhao has been doing. She's a psychologist who's done research on and has been part of developing cash transfer initiatives. What Dr. Zhao has researched is how poverty actually impacts your ability to think. So she's done research showing that it limits your cognitive capacity. It actually lowers your ability, your intelligence level, by in IQ standards. It also limits your ability to think beyond immediacy. It limits your opportunities to plan for anything. So when you think of that and you try and think of it, it's often hard for those of us who aren't in those situations, even if we've ever been in those situations, to contemplate how debilitating poverty can be. And earlier this year, I was up in the Yukon and talking about this, talking about Dr. Zhao's research. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and said, I grew up middle class, I have an education, and what you were talking about wouldn't have made any sense to me until I ended up homeless myself. She had left an abusive relationship. Everything had been in her partner's name. She suddenly had no resources. And she said, all I could think about, I couldn't think about applying for a job. I couldn't think about doing anything except, did I have enough cash to put gas in my car so that I could run it enough that I wouldn't freeze at night? She said, then if I had enough for that, did I have anything to buy food or to get food, or was there somewhere I could eat for free? And she said, a friend who didn't ask any questions, knew something was going on, basically said, you're coming to stay with us, put me up in her spare room. And she said, within a month I had a job. Within a week I was applying, and within a month I had a job. And if I had never experienced that, I would have questioned what you were saying, because I couldn't have imagined that in her case, a very short, compared to what many people's lives of living without economic security are, I could not have imagined that being poor, having no money, would limit my thinking that much until it happened to me. She said, if it happened to me and I have all this privilege and I'm white, compared to so many others, no wonder people get stuck in homelessness, get stuck on the street, how do you think about, if you're just trying to figure out where you're going to put your head that night, that's going to be, not put you at greater risk? How do you think about it when you have no way to buy food? How do you think about, oh, gee, I see a job sign here. How do you get yourself organized to actually go in there and apply for that job? And so I think we often don't see these issues through any other eyes than our own. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of quote it's heavy, but it's important. And I hope people think about it, because oftentimes people think of that as just rhetoric. And I'm sorry, the people who spout rhetoric are mostly on this little part of the world that I live right now. It's not the people who are actually struggling to survive on the street.
Sometimes a criticism that comes up about basic income is that there's people who are outside of the tax system who aren't filing their taxes every year because of poverty. But Dr. Evelyn Forget has talked about like a one-page tax filing page that's been used in some Indigenous communities. And I think as a result of the new budget, there's going to be some automatic tax filing so that people who are a little more vulnerable and marginalized will automatically get like the carbon rebate and GST credits and stuff like that. So do you think that concern is a little bit overblown, and there are probably some pretty easy ways to work around that?
Well, I think there are ways to work around it. It's whether people want to work around it. And so, yeah, I mean, one of the concerns that a number of us on the Finance Committee have raised is that anywhere from 10 to 12% of the Canadian population who are of, tax paying age, if I can put it, over 18 or, aren't registered. And I think that's for two reasons. One, many of them don't think there's any benefit to it. The late Hugh Segal used to always say he would encourage, when he was teaching, he would encourage his students to register, not because they owed taxes, but because they didn't get benefits like would otherwise be entitled to. So, I think, and part of it's rooted in a lack of trust in the government, which I think is a legitimate concern for many people who their only experience with the government is to see it as an oppressive force rather than a force that is emancipatory. And so I think there are some easy fixes, as Dr. Forget has said, but there's also some reasons I think it would also benefit the government, because the reason people are supportive of things like pharmacare and dental care and Medicare is because the attempt is to make it universally available for those who need it when they need it, and not to penalize people because they're poor. And this would be along the same vein of saying, let's provide opportunities for those who need access to economic supports and not penalize those who haven't made enough money. One of my colleagues who's really interested in offshore tax evasion once said to me, if we solve the offshore tax evasion issue, if we actually, during the Finance Committee, I'm often asking the question of how many people who are named in the Panama and Pandora Papers, for instance, have been prosecuted? Virtually none. How much money has been regained? $0. Now, when you know that there's billions and billions of dollars that are going, is tax money that should be going into the coffer, to benefit Canadians, benefit people in this country, and they're going offshore and avoiding taxes, why wouldn't we want to improve that? And I think if we did both together, there would be a huge increase in the support of, the government, of being actually concerned about taking care of people, not just letting people languish in poverty or without what they need.
And it might help us pay for basic income.
And it would absolutely help us. That was the point, that he was making that I failed to get to, which is, if you actually solve this, you could fund all of it. His comment was, you could fund all that stuff you're interested in, Kim, and lots more. And, we look to Scandinavian countries, and their refusal to allow natural resources to be used for capitalist gain, and instead have required those be seen as national resources there in places like Norway and Finland. The resources were kept in the country to help ensure that every single person in each, even the most remote community at the end of a fjord, had access to healthcare, education, housing, and supports. And so, you don't see the same sort of poverty and homelessness that we see here in those countries. And there's a reason for that. And we see an overall well-being and standard of living being much higher for everybody. Why wouldn't we want that for everybody here?
Our welfare systems are really failing people in Canada, in all provinces, women, youth, people with mental health issues, and people from racialized groups. The new Mate report found that the welfare income of 43 out of 44 households receiving social assistance in the provinces were below Canada's official poverty line. That's 98% of households were living below the poverty line in 2023. That number's obscene, but it also misses a more shocking reality that 1 in 10 Canadians are living in poverty, and that on average, 71% of people on social assistance are living in deep poverty, which means that they're living on less than 75% of the poverty line. And for a lot of single adults, it's like below 50% of the poverty line.
Yeah, I mean, for decades, I've been saying that our rates of social assistance in this country, in every single jurisdiction, are criminally low. We have an opportunity to do something very different. Why we wouldn't encourage provinces and territories to link to the federal government, to have streamline the administration of those regimes through, say, the tax system, and provide adequate incomes from people that could vary. Of course, the standard of and the cost of living in downtown Toronto is very different from rural PEI. But we already have taxation schemes that adjust for those sorts of things. We could do the same thing with income streams. And so I'm hoping that groups like Mate and others will come on side to say, instead of just incrementally giving little bits more in each province and territory to social assistance, why don't we actually look at this in a more comprehensive way and say, let's make sure that everybody, not just some people, are taken care of, not just some provinces do this, that we actually embark on an initiative that says, let's leave nobody behind.
And former Senator Art Eggleton spoke at one of the committee meetings, and he said, speaking about poverty, he said, it takes a toll on people's lives with the loss of dignity, marginalization, stress, and anxiety. Our current social assistance and welfare system frequently trap people in poverty. And then he quoted the late Senator Hugh Segal, who said, our present system doesn't fight poverty, it institutionalizes it.
I agree. I can't say it better than that. And in Hugh Segal's last book, Bootstraps Need Boots, I think said it all. The common adage is, people should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Well, how do you do that if you don't even have boots? And I think that kind of thinking is what we really need to challenge. And similarly, the research that Dr. Forget, that Dr. Zhao are doing, that shows, the most common stigmatizing myth that people have about what a basic income will do is, I've heard it from colleagues in the Senate, I've heard it from many folks, is, it'll just create a whole bunch of lazy layabouts. It'll be, the most privileged, the 30-year-olds will go live in their parents' basements and collect basic income. Well, there are ways to address that. Dr. Forget has talked about it. Dr. Zhao has talked about it. But the fact that we presume that when all the evidence consistently shows the opposite, that when people get money, people who don't have money get money, the only people who stay home more are people taking care of other people, whether it's their children, people with disabilities, their parents, or people who are training to get, whether it's trades or an education to get a better job. Why wouldn't we want to support that? How is that negative to any of us, that people are taking care of other people, or that they're trying to get ahead themselves, trying to better their opportunities for the future. And yet those are there's no research showing that suddenly there's a whole bunch of people. And then Dr. Zhao's research has gone even further, and she's showing that people who got cash transfers, actually, including people with addictions, spent less money on drugs, alcohol, and cigarettes. She's also showing that, in fact, when you provide resources, people aren't anesthetizing themselves to horrific realities as much anymore because their realities aren't as horrific, and so their consumption of things like drugs and alcohol is reduced. Again, why wouldn't we want that? And I mean, hers is the only research I know of that has looked at those issues. But how often do we hear those kinds of negative stereotypes about, people, if people on social assistance are just, eating cake and drinking beer? It's like, really? Come take a walk with me, buddy, and see what they're actually eating.
People don't realize, speaking of like welfare rates being so low, people go days without eating.
Yeah.
It's just horrible. So in terms of what you were saying about people staying home and people bettering themselves, I think pretty much like all the studies that have been done on basic income show that people don't work less. They essentially just end up doing trainings or getting better jobs, and just having more flexibility around their work life.
Absolutely. And as in a time when we are short of personal support workers, when there's an increasing focus on the aging population that's going to require more care, surely we are going to need some of these individuals being able to do more of that work, not less of it.
For sure. One of the strangest arguments that I hear against basic income is that it's not really good for like working people. It seems completely backwards, in that like a basic income provides an income floor so working people know that they won't fall below a certain income level, and it gives workers who are like working in poverty more freedom and a hand up so they can actually work their way out of poverty, what we're talking about. But people actually like say it won't help workers, which I don't even really understand. You even counter that argument sometimes?
Yeah, oh, for sure. I mean, my response is, why wouldn't we not want living wages and benefits for everybody? I mean, one of the biggest shocks to many people during the pandemic was how many people working full-time jobs at minimum wage without benefits were living in shelters. Because before the pandemic, they could work 2 and 3 jobs, full-time jobs in many cases, make enough money to make ends meet. But in 90% of the communities in this country, people working full-time at minimum wage jobs cannot afford to rent a 1-bedroom apartment. Yeah. Now, how is that something we want to sustain? And, some people don't like it when I say this, but I mean, that's some of the same arguments were made for not getting rid of slavery, is that we couldn't afford the labor costs. Really? Like, at what level do we counter, responses that say it's okay to dehumanize and devalue certain individuals and exploit them for their labor, and it's not okay to do that to others? I mean, imagine, a number of us suggested we all take cuts to our paychecks during the pandemic on the Hill. Do you think that ever passed anywhere? No. And in fact, I'm told that when the guaranteed income supplement for seniors was first introduced, part of the way it was produced was actually one of my colleagues, Colin Deacon's father, was a provincial minister, and he basically called for, I think, for their wages to be cut or eliminated until such time as they dealt with poverty for seniors. It'd be good to ask Colin Deacon that story, but Hugh Segal told me that story and said, that was part of how the pressure was put on for the politicians to actually finally step up and create more supports for seniors.
And just to finish on the topic, the Ontario pilot, even though it was cut short, it did show that people continued working or sought better jobs or did training.
That's right.
So it's just better for society.
That's right.
And people.
Yeah, and even in a context where it didn't finish, with the short time that it existed, many people were able to just do that bit more and get ahead because they had the income supports.
Okay, let's get to the bills. Your bill S233 and Leah Gazan's bill C223. A lot of people probably don't even know that there are currently two basic income bills in the Senate and the House of Commons. Can you just tell us a little bit about them, maybe focusing on yours and just kind of where they're at currently?
Sure. So Bill S233 is before the Standing Senate Committee on Finance, uh, we're likely to have a few more witnesses, and then my hope is the bill will pass, go to third reading, and then go over to the House of Commons. What the bill would require is the government to actually embark upon a discussions with provinces, territories, and First Nations governance bodies to talk about how we could set up a framework to develop a guaranteed livable income for Canada. So I'm as a senator, I'm in a private bill. I'm not allowed to overtly cost the government money, so I couldn't just say start doing what we all want to say, which just let's just do this. Let's just start a basic income. So this would be what's called framework legislation to develop a plan for how we can move together. The benefit of that is for people who still are maybe on the fence or not so sure about it, it provides an opportunity for all of those questions to also be answered. And so while we have fact sheets and material that people can look at, and we encourage people to go to our website and get that information, it's really clear that the case is mounting for this. So there are more and more examples of how and why this would benefit, not just people who are living in poverty, but all of us. For one thing, the fact that people would not be in abject poverty would cost us less, but it also would increase overall standard of living for all of us. And let's face it, I don't think there are any people anywhere, regardless of their level of privilege, that think the level of homelessness and poverty that exists in this country now is okay. And the reality is, anybody who thinks it's all about just whether people are working hard enough is so out of touch with reality that I'm not sure what else to suggest for those folks. But the reality is, most everybody recognizes this is not a function. When we see real estate going through the roof, when we see large companies like grocery chains hiking up the cost of groceries and then paying out huge dividends to shareholders, that there are other ways that we could be dealing with this. And I think we need to be simultaneously creating more equal and equitable tax systems. We need to be dealing with competition policies, and we also need to be dealing with actually taking care of folks who right now are being not just ignored, but being plunged into deep poverty.
Mm-hmm. And there's pretty much a guarantee that there will be an election, at least in the next, not necessarily in the next year, but at least in a year from now. And so your bill and Leah's bill are kind of making their way through the House and the Senate. Yours has been at committee for a while. There's already been 3 readings. How are you feeling just generally about like the support for it, but also like the timeline and all that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm always hopeful that it'll get through, but the reality is it will take people insisting that we want this in Canada for it to happen. I think it should be on the party platforms of every single party, that if any party is not considering how to deal with poverty and what their position is on a guaranteed livable income, then I would not be voting for them if I was anybody in this country. I think we have to know what is every party going to commit to do if they end up governing after the next election. And I think we're entitled to know that, and it'll be to the benefit of all of us if we have a subsequent government that is clearly interested in taking care of folks and building robust social, economic, and health systems.
Mm-hmm. It's really, I mean, with basic income, it eliminating poverty and all the things that come along with poverty, it really seems like there's not a more comprehensive, simple, straightforward type of policy that could have such an amazing impact on society in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's in some cases, people think it's too simplistic. It can't be that easy. The reality is, poor people need money. You know, when people say, "Oh, they need services and programs," that's true too. But a service and program doesn't put food on the table. A service and program doesn't put, provide you with the economic security that you can actually move ahead. And, you can have all the budgeting training in the world. If you don't have enough money, forget trying to budget. You can't budget zero. And so, so none of it, I think most people are not in any way suggesting an economic and only approach. What we're talking about is saying, let's streamline the economic supports that are there. Let's make sure they're adequate. Let's not continue to waste, millions and billions of dollars on administering those. Let's figure out a more efficient way to do that. And then free up people, the people who go to school, who go train, who are experienced, who are elders, who want to mentor and support other people. Let's free up their time to do that, not have them continuing to administer totally inadequate programs and do what, many describe as soul-destroying work themselves, of trying to figure out how do you tell a single mom who, says, I can't make ends meet. Oh yeah, you can if you just budget. When that is absolutely not true, that you couldn't survive yourself. When I finished talking at one point about the social assistance rates in this country, in the chamber, afterwards, a couple of my colleagues came up and said, that can't be right. That can't be all people get for food every day. I spend more on my one coffee I get in the morning to start the day than what you described. And I said, that's right. You say it can't be true? Come with me. You try and survive on that kind of money without getting a handout from your family or someone else to help, to feed you. We are setting people up. We are setting people up to fail every day, and we need to stop it.
So many people that I talk to are just completely taken aback when I tell them what social assistance rates are. It's so blatantly traps people in poverty that no one can survive off. In Ontario, and it was similarly in most provinces, it's $733 a month. People can't even pay rent, you can't buy groceries, you can't do anything. And to go back to what you were saying, I don't think anyone in the basic income movement has ever said that we don't need other programs as well. But like you were talking about with the cognitive tax on scarcity, people can't even if there are other programs, people don't even have the bandwidth to access them because they're struggling with putting food on the table, or they're just like they've been hungry for days and they can't even think, or they're trying to get their kids to school or get food for their kids. Like, there's a million things that come along with poverty. And people can't even access the programs.
No, and we keep lurching towards it. And, Evelyn Forget talked about, building this trust in people, that we still say there are certain people who, the BC panel said this, it's like we incrementally will help elders, okay, we'll help poor kids, we'll help some Indigenous people, we'll help, kids in school have a food program. I can't tell you how many elders, Member of Parliament Laurie Idloot said it to me just recently. She said, why don't they just give families that money instead of developing yet another program, another administration, another whole complex way of putting that in place? Say, trust the parents, give them money so that they can actually feed their kids before they go to school, and provide the supports for those kids. And it's because we don't trust people. And who do we trust? We trust the wealthy people who are taking the money offshore more than we trust the poor people. And we're seeing that even, in the decisions about who the government's going after in the post-pandemic benefits. They're going after people who got more served than that to which they were, someone deemed they were entitled, not going after the companies that took wage subsidies and then paid out dividends to shareholders. Like, how is that okay? So, who we determine deserves and who's deserving and who's not deserving is a function of our discriminatory attitudes as well. And I think that has to be laid bare.
So for our Put Food Banks Out of Business campaign that we're going to be launching on October 17th, 2024, the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, we are going to be pushing MPs and the Prime Minister and ministers to, and all MPs to get basic income on their party platforms. But we also have the two bills that are currently on the way. So for people watching, what's the best thing for us to do right now? Obviously, people will be able to go to putfoodbanksoutofbusiness.com and email their MPs and the Prime Minister. But what else can people do? What do you think would be the most impactful thing for people to do right now?
Call up your member of parliament, call up the senators in your region, and they're all listed on the website. Get in touch and let them know. And the best thing is a personal call, because a call or a personal email. And we receive hundreds and thousands of emails every day. And on this, we have been receiving lots, and I think it's important. And when you see them in your community, let them know you want to see this sort of approach. Ask every party what their position is on a guaranteed livable income. And you're entitled to know, and you're entitled to have what people need in order to survive.
So we want to be calling our MPs, calling senators, but mainly MPs probably?
Yeah, I mean senators as well,
Senators
but
as well?
MPs are...
And just telling them we support a basic income and we want to see a basic income in Canada.
Yeah, and pass those bills and get working on it.
Okay.
And put it on your party platform for the election.
And put it on your party platform for the election. Okay, thank you so much for chatting with us today about basic income and your bills, and we will do everything we can to put food banks out of business